Welcome. Welcome to part 2 of our Inner Life series. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the split that we all have experienced in our lives. Right from earliest times, we've been taught to be split. We've developed a split self. And that split self was developed by people who wanted the best for us, but wanted us to be appropriate for the outside world. So in an effort to make us well-behaved, attractive, desirable, acceptable, we were taught manners. We were taught how to ask, how to apologize, how to do all sorts of things to fit in with a culture that needed us to fit in. And so that acceptable self, that external appropriate self became very dominant in our experience, because the risk was, if we didn't behave, if we weren't right, if we weren't acceptable, we would be rejected. And so we learned to say please and thank you and sorry and may I have some more. We learned all sorts of things, but that developed into a self that was what we call the outer self. The split off part became the inner self, the part that we weren't supposed to be, the part that wasn't okay, the part that was weak, the part that cried when it shouldn't cry, the part that stole a cookie or a biscuit when it wasn't allowed to, or that told a bit of a lie. And the inner self became that part which wasn't acceptable on the outside. And that was the part that was hidden, the part that was put away. And that became our inner self. And that inner self split as well. And that split into the part that managed the outer self and the part that was hidden even from ourselves. So we developed an inner self that, and I call it the false self. But the false self was the one that wanted us to be acceptable, that wanted to cope, that wanted to have its own way. Even maybe on the outside it pretended to be well-mannered, but on the inside it was manipulative. It was that part that that divided the shameful self, because the true self was almost banished. It was the part that was sent right away. It was hidden totally, and so that this inner false self became almost the puppet master, or the manipulator, the controller, and it would manage the outer self. It would manage what it wanted. How did we get what we wanted? We would know how to ask the right people. Sometimes we'd ask mom because dad would say no. Sometimes we'd tease a sibling and get them to cry, and then we would pretend something else. So that false inner self became the controller, and its main object, or its main purpose, was to get for us what we thought it wanted. What it thought we wanted. And so we learned how to manipulate reality. We learned how to play games. We learned how to say what we wanted to people to believe about us. It sometimes was deceptive. It sometimes was even deceiving ourselves. It would say things that weren't fully true. It would control in ways that it felt would get us what we wanted. Sometimes that false inner self even controlled us. It confused us because it told us what we wanted to hear. I remember somebody saying, I'm the easiest person to fool. He was talking about himself. And it's the part of ourselves that tells us what we want to hear. It's the part that finds people to agree with itself and won't go to people who disagree. So it almost builds up a case for itself. It builds up a whole identity in terms of who it is, in terms of what it wants, in terms of what it's about. And so that part of ourselves, it controls the way we are. It controls who we are. It controls how we are. And it becomes very much an inner control center, and prevents us from actually developing and becoming our full true selves. Our true self, the part that was split off, the part that was shut out, is often the part that didn't fit in very well. It might have been the little boy crying and that was shamed and bullied, and we might feel, I never want to be like that again. I never want to appear weak. It might have been the girl that never wanted to feel that she wasn't popular, and so she might manipulate her friends. But the part that was wanting to be loved and wanting to be cared about was pushed away. And this little girl might become quite manipulative and controlling and quite nasty. So we find ourselves in a situation where we have an inner self that it filters life for us. It controls the way we are. It controls what we think, how we think. It justifies itself. It rationalizes a lot of who we are. And the problem is it blocks us from our true self. It blocks us from accessing that part of ourselves which is longing for life, that part which is the more true, the more relevant, the more whole part. It's the part that God wants to access, because when God created us, He created us to become a full self. And just like a seed that's planted becomes a whole plant, a whole tree or plant, we were created to become a whole self. But we've developed in a society which splits us up and splits us off from parts of ourselves. And so we find ourselves in a place where we cannot be fully ourselves because we're frightened, we might be rejected, we won't be acceptable, we won't be good enough, we won't match up, we won't measure up. And the side where on the outside we try to be acceptable, we try to be attractive, we try to be wanted. And we find ourselves in this strange situation where we're not at home in ourselves, in the society we find ourselves in. And for most of us, life becomes trying to keep the outside happy, trying to justify behaving the way we do. The false self is attracted by what the outer self offers, what the outer world offers. When we try to be attractive, when we try to be acceptable, when we try to be clever, when we try to be successful, when we try to be wealthy, all the efforts to find acceptance on the outside is wanting to be acceptable on the outside because we are terrified of not being acceptable. And so this false self keeps us playing this game. It keeps us on a footing where we are constantly trying to be what we think will make us happy and make us acceptable. The fact that most of us, for most of our lives, find ourselves not really satisfied with who we are and the way our lives are going should tell us a lot about that false self and how it controls and manages who we are. In fact, all of us, I could say, as we are now, are the product of our false self and the false self's ideas of what we should be and how we should be. And we become captive to that false self. We become captive to that which it says we should be and we must avoid not being. And so we come into a place of captivity. We are in a prison, and that prison is ourselves, and we are the wardens of that prison. We're the prisoner and we're the warden, and we keep ourselves there. And that false self has a very powerful hold on us because it threatens us. It threatens us with rejection. It threatens us with fearful consequences. So it uses emotion, fear, anxiety, discomfort. It uses the threat of rejection, of not being acceptable, of being shameful, of being different, of not being wanted. But it also tries to get us to live up to the dreams and ideals that it imagines we could achieve. It presents grandiose options. Imagine if we were wealthy. Friends of mine spend money on the lotto every week, and they imagine that if one day they win the lotto, won't it be wonderful? Well, what would you do with a lot of money if you didn't know who you were? But it presents us with dreams and ideals which actually blind us to the prison we're in. It's interesting how the world offers us much and delivers very little. And we need to be aware that the false self is the part of ourselves that will drink up all those idealized offerings. Maybe when I meet a new person, or maybe when I have an attractive friend or attractive girlfriend, or a masculine man who's very attractive, or when I'm wealthy, or when I have this new car, which is really everybody's envy, then I'll feel happy. But the false self also betrays our trust, because it sets us up. And even when we do have the fancy car, we're no really happier, because then it's another car we want, or another situation we want. So the false self is very much in the middle of our being. It controls us, and it blocks us from really living. And I think all of us, I would say all of us, most of us, certainly, identify with the false self and think, well, that's me. We don't realize that it's a choice that I've made for a long time, over my period of my life, and I've learned patterns of behavior which have actually not become helpful, patterns which have got me into situations that aren't for my own best interest, that aren't actually for who I am, and that aren't going to get me out of anything. So unless we change those patterns, all we can do in our lives is go down the same road of getting more and more entrenched in a false self that never delivers. It always offers more, but it never delivers. And our returns are steadily decreasing. And it causes a lot of anxiety. It causes a lot of distress. Many people are on medication because they can't cope with the feelings that come up, the feelings of negativity, the feelings of anxiety, of fear, of failure, of distress of different kinds. And so we're needing to ask ourselves, am I really living from my true center? Or am I living to fit in with a society that is always wanting more and always delivering less? Because the world we live in, the life we live, offers us the world and gives us almost nothing in return. And we all subscribe to that life, which is why it has a hold on us. But we find that the returns are very small. And so we need to come to a place where we start to question ourselves and say, well, why am I living like this? Why do I make certain choices? Why do I allow myself to be told the same things over and over again? A good example is advertising. It advertises and offers us happiness. Over and over again, we offered happiness if we do this, or if we buy that, if we try this. And yet, if we look back, has it really changed our lives? If anything, it's just got us more stuck in false hopes, in false dreams that don't deliver. And so we need to stop and say, well, what is really going on? And those of us who have faith need to also ask ourselves, where does God fit into this? Is God part of the external, wanting us to be something that we're not? Or is God really on the inside saying, when are you going to wake up to the fact that you're not being who I made you to be? When are you going to take the risk of beginning to become your true self? Because remember, society has always been invested in making us a product of itself. It never wants us to be unique. It never wants us to be our true selves. It always wants us to be an adherent to its own paradigm, to its own agenda. And God meets us here and says, there's another way. There's a different way. There's a way that actually would be more satisfying and more appropriate to who you are. And so we find Jesus speaking some words which are puzzling, but he's speaking them on different levels. And what he's saying is, if you want to save your life, you must lose it. If you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. And so what is he really saying? He's saying, if you want to find your life, if you want to find your true life, you must be willing to give up your false life. I wrote it on the board here. If you save your false life, you will lose your true life. But if you lose your false life for my sake, you will find your true life. So the question he leaves us with is, do you want your true life, or will you carry on holding and protecting and managing your false life? Because our false life, we know, will take us nowhere. It will never take us to a maturity, to a wisdom, and to a fulfillment which God invites us to. And so we need to ask ourselves tough questions. What kind of life do I want to live? And what life is Jesus speaking about when he speaks about, do I want to find my life? And the life we want to find is the true life that he's given us. And so we need to shift some of our attitudes, some of the paradigms on which we live all the time. We need to give up some of the ideas that we have about ourselves and the striving that we continuously exert in trying to change gear without changing gear. We're trying to find life without giving up the life that is actually false. The poet Kavanagh has written an interesting poem, and I'll just read one phrase of it, one passage. It's called The Self-Slaved, The Enslaved Self, by Patrick Kavanagh. Me, he says, me I will throw away. Me I will throw away. Me sufficient for the day. The sticky self that clings, adhesions on the wings of love and adventure. To go on the grand tour, a person must be free from self-necessity. So he's saying, me I will throw away, and I will get rid of the sticky self that blocks me growing. It's a bit like when aeroplanes are in very cold climates and ice sticks to the wings, they can't fly because they're too heavy. Birds also, when they have too much ice on their wings, I'm not sure if birds have the same problem, but certainly aeroplanes do. Sometimes ships also, when they get too much ice on the superstructure, the ship becomes top heavy and will sometimes roll over. But the ice on the wings actually loads the plane so that it can't fly. And Kavanagh says he will throw away, he will remove that sticky self, the sticky false self that sticks to the self and prevents it becoming the true self, that prevents love and prevents adventure. And to go on the grand tour, he was speaking about young men and women to fulfill or to finish their education would go on a tour of Europe, seeing all the museums and speaking to all the philosophers and great personages, and so would finish their education. But for that, he says, we must be free from self-necessity. I found that a good poem to just understand that there's a sticky false self that is tiresome, that is wearying, that we need to get tired of ourselves. We know our own games, we know our own patterns, we know the aspects of ourselves that hold us back. We know the phrases in us, in our mind, that prevents us taking risks, that wants us to be comfortable, that gets very irritable when we're uncomfortable, and that just wants us to be cozy and in control and able to just hold our lives as we've always had it. But that kind of life is is a slow death. Like somebody said, don't be scared that you'll one day die. Be truly scared that you will have never lived. And the sticky self prevents us from ever really living. It just wants to repeat the same old pattern that has kept us safe, that has kept us stuck, that has kept us hopefully acceptable in the society we're in. A society which actually cares very little about us. And yet there's a God who cares deeply about us and wants to feed our hunger, because our hunger in the false self just gets more and more of a world that doesn't satisfy. It's like being famished and eating junk food and finding that it only sickens. It doesn't really satisfy. And God has put that hunger in us, a hunger for himself and a hunger for ourselves in him, to explore and to become that true self, to take the risk, to begin to own ourselves, to say, this is who I am, this is what I need to, this is the direction I need to be in. It's not easy, because it's not like a switch that you flick from the false self to the true inner self. Because the false inner self has so taken over that we don't know who we are without it. We don't know who we are apart from it. When people ask us who we are, we just parrot out the same old phrases about what we do, what we like, where we live, what we earn, and what we drive, and our marriage status, all the things that we describe ourselves as, but all stuck on that sticky self, the self that prevents us from truly living. And so when Jesus says we need to die to ourselves, it sounds like quite a shocking statement. And we would almost say, well, rather just put that self aside and rather slowly move to the true self. Well, the false self is like a sickness. When we recover from a sickness and the sickness has died, we are relieved that it no longer has a hold on us. If that sickness is just sort of malingering or an undercurrent, there's always a danger it will come back. There's always a threat that it will resurge and take hold again. In fact, the next time it will probably be worse, because our body will have got accustomed to it and won't be defended from it. It's a bit like something that we inoculated against, but that the inoculation doesn't work and it comes back more virulent. So when he says die to the false self, die to the old self, die to the worldly self, he's not being mean. He's just saying let that self stop. Step out of that self and come into the new self. Begin to take the risk of finding your new self, your whole self, yourself born from above. When he says to Nicodemus, you need to be born from above, we need to be spiritually motivated, not worldly motivated. When we are worldly motivated, we're giving the world power over us, and we're constantly at the beck of the world. We are accountable to the world. Last week I left you with a question, last part, who are you accountable to? And for most of us, certainly in the false self, we're accountable to the world. Am I good enough? Have I got enough? Am I doing enough? Do I know the right people? Have I got enough power? Do I have the right influence? Do I have the right job? Do I have the right car? Do I have the right appearances? And we need to break that tie and make ourselves accountable to God, because God will only ask us, will you be you? Will you follow me and allow me to help you to find the true you? And so in the process of letting go of the false self, we need to begin by just being fed up with it, tired of it, nauseated by it, tired of our games we've played all our life but don't work for us. We know they don't work, and yet why do we carry on playing them? The patterns that defeat us and keep us thinking the wrong things of ourselves, thinking the wrong things of other people, and in the wrong power structures all our lives. And so the beginning is to really be tired of that self and just to put it down, to let it go, to release ourselves from it, to free ourselves from that prison of self. And then we can also begin to be more honest with ourselves. What do I really want? Is this really me? Am I being honest? Or am I just being half honest? Am I pretending? Am I saying yes because I want people to like me? Can I begin to say, no, sorry, I can't? Can I begin to be honest with myself and say, this is what I need, I don't need that? That famous line, here I stand, I can do no other. Can we begin to say, where do I stand? And what do I stand for? People say, if you don't stand for anything, you will fall for everything. And so we need to begin to stand for that which we believe is appropriate. And it's a journey. It's not like one day we don't have it, the next day we have it all. We begin a slow shift in the direction of beginning to be more true, beginning to be more honest, beginning to be more appropriate to ourselves, to God, and to the others. Because people, at first, they won't like us when we're not buttering them up and playing their games. But after a while, we'll find that those who truly do like us will like us more because we can becoming more honest than playing games which will never satisfy. So as we begin to say, no, not that, it's easier to stop doing what we know is not us, because the true self is so buried, so hidden, so rejected, that it's actually very hard to find. The minute we start to want to entertain it or try to in somehow access it, a lot of discomfort will come up. And that discomfort is often what puts people off. But the self that we've shamed, the self that we've allowed to be rejected and pushed away and tried to cut off, is not going to come back without a whole memory bank of feelings of rejection, of painful distress. And so in beginning to move to a more true self, we need to accept that there are going to be feelings that are not pleasant. But the feelings themselves are not a sign of failure or of rejection. They're just a sign of a place that's needing to be healed. A place that's needing attention. A place needing compassion, self-compassion. When you start reflecting on places in ourselves where we were rejected, where we were mocked and shamed and bullied, where we were told we were never good enough, where we were told that we were a disappointment, all those areas will be painful to re-access. But in looking for our true self, we can begin to say, not that, not that, not that. So what we do know is what we do have, and that's what we don't, that's not it. So it's easier to begin by saying, I don't need that, I don't want this, I'm not going to do that anymore. And to begin to push away those parts of ourselves that we are aware of, and that we are aware that are deadening us and overloading us with stuff that is not appropriate. And we might well find ourselves coming into a place of emptiness. So if I'm not that, who am I? Well, we won't know. Because also the false self that was rejected, that was sent off into exile, as it were, is not going to come bounding back saying, oh, here I am, thanks for having me. It'll be hiding behind big rocks and saying, well, I'm not so sure. Is this a game or is this a trick? You want me to come out so that you can defeat me further? So we might well find ourselves as we push away those aspects which are not us, not true to ourselves, we come into an emptiness. We come into an uncertainty. We come into almost like a no person's land. Do we belong here? Who are we here? We don't know who we are here. But we need to trust ourselves, and we need to trust God and know that as we let go of the false self, we'll come into a place where we start making ourselves open and available to the true self. Then slowly we'll begin to feel movements of life, movements of, what about trying this? Take a risk there. Remember this hard memory. What about letting it go, forgiving it, the person who did this to me? We'll find ourselves coming into a new inner terrain, a terrain where we feel familiar, but we feel alienated. It's a place that we've walked away from long ago, and we've been taught to reject and even hate ourselves. I remember counseling a man who just sat in front of me and he says, I loathe myself with a loathing that is profound. If I could do away with myself without hurting people, I would do so. Whoever teaches us to loathe, to hate ourselves to such depth, well, it's a world that wants us to be a product of itself. And so as we begin to re-embrace, engage that lost self, that broken self, that rejected self, the self that was sent off into exile, the self that was imprisoned because it wasn't acceptable, it wasn't good enough, it wasn't what we wanted to be, it wasn't what our parents thought we should be. So much of us that was just pushed away. It's a risk to begin to re-embrace and reconnect and reaffirm ourselves. We find one of the keys is that we have to begin to deny the false self's demand that we keep that self in prison. It doesn't want that self to come out. It will fight to keep that self hidden, murdered, if nothing else. And so we have to begin to take the risk of standing up for that self and to invite that self to be embraced again, to take the risk of being loved, of being wanted. It's there that our power lies. It's there that our uniqueness lies. It's there that our true love comes from. The false self can't give true love. It can only give conditional love, manipulative love. So if we're stuck in the false self, we'll never really love as God loves. But in the true self, we can begin to truly love as we are able, as we are called to, love that is truly transformative. And so part of the risk of moving into the true self is that we have to begin to disappoint people who want us to carry on being who we've always wanted to be. People will say, what's wrong with you? You've changed. You're not the old self we knew. And that might be difficult to hear. It might be difficult to say, well, I've decided to become more honest with myself, more honest with God, and to care less about what other people think of me. T.S. Eliot, in one of his poems, has a beautiful line. It says, Lord, teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to care and not to care. And sometimes we must be willing to disappoint people, to not care what they think, because that caring about what they think keeps us trapped and enslaved. People who love us for who we are will be glad that we're coming to freedom. People who love us for what we can give them will be angry with us when we start to break that bond. When we start to free ourselves from their tie, from their control. So it's a scary journey because in a way we're letting go of all the things that have held us and affirmed us, even though in a falseness. But God promises to actually take over that role and to affirm us and to support us. And in fact, He's doing all He can every day in little events to help us to begin to take the risk of becoming our true self. When He says we need to die to the false self, He's the one who will orchestrate what we need to make the transition, to transfer our weight from the false self to the true self. And once the true self starts to get more muscle and more stability, more substance, it will begin to show on the outer self. We'll begin to be more honest, more true, more able to look people in the eye and stand for who we are. Less apologetic and less trying to please them for acceptance sake. So the journey to true self takes us through quite a quagmire of falseness. A place where there's not much honesty with ourselves, where there's a lot of game playing, where there's a lot of manipulation of reality, maybe even some lying, some dishonesty, some pretense. But on the far side of this river, of this squidgy self, this self that is so tiresome, we begin to find some reality, some truth, some firmness. And remember, that self has been rejected for so long, it takes a while. And don't be in a hurry. It takes a while to begin to firm up, to begin to build muscle and presence and character and to begin to stand its ground. As it's said in Afrikaans, staan jou plek vol. Stand your place full. Be yourself fully. But it takes time. So give yourself time and know you're on a journey of transformation. And our Lord walks with us on that journey. And He'll never overwhelm us, but He'll always challenge us and stretch us to become more and more appropriate to who He's wanting us to be. The self that He made us to be, the self that will be fulfilling and meaningful and totally pleasing or appropriate for us, because the shoe fits, the self fits. And so I'll leave you with that, and with the question this week: who have I disappointed? This week, have I been able to say no? This week, have I been able to take the risk to begin to be honest with myself and to expose my dishonesty? And if not in the past week, in the coming week, that's my invitation to, in small ways, to begin to make big changes to the way I see myself and hold myself and manage myself and direct myself, because that's the way Jesus is calling me to be. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next time. Bye.